Hi, I'm Matt Stoller, and welcome to another Big Breakdown. So I'm a policy advocate and a writer, and I study the economy. And the goal of these videos is to teach you how parts of the economy work and how we write laws to structure those parts of the economy, to structure markets. So today we're going to talk about pot, marijuana. And I have an interview with someone who actually writes laws to structure marijuana markets. All right, so in 1933, the American government ratified the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, which formally ended the prohibition of alcohol. Just a few years later, in 1937, we made marijuana illegal. So we replaced one form of prohibition with another. Now, since then, being tough on drugs has been as American as apple pie.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive.
But this hostility to illegal drugs has slowly waned in the last 20 years. 19 states have legalized pot completely, 37 have made medicinal marijuana legal. But as late as 10 years ago, the drug war sentiment was still quite strong, places like Congress and among our political elites. So for instance, in 2011, Republican House Speaker John Boehner said, quote, "I am unalterably opposed to the legalization of marijuana or any other FDA Schedule I drug." Standard drug warrior. But Boehner and other politicians were fighting a losing battle on America's second prohibition. The question today, maybe even a few years ago, was no longer whether pot will become legal. It's now when and how. Now, one way we know that is to listen to the same politicians who were formerly so tough on drugs and how they've now become ardent supporters of legalizing marijuana. So starting a few years ago, a bunch of them, former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, former Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, former House Leader, former Congressman Joe Crowley, they suddenly changed their boomer mindset, as did, surprise, surprise, John Boehner himself.
Like most Americans over the last 10 years, people's opinion on this issue have evolved. And I felt myself, like any other American, my position evolving over the years. But I never really thought much about it until Kevin and I began conversations 4, 5, 6 months ago. And I thought to myself, this might be something that I could lend my voice to that makes sense.
And the fact that you're joining the board, does that mean now you see a path in which either state regulations spread like wildfire or the federal level begins to embrace this instead of reject it?
Now, if you want to legalize pot, which most people do, you'll see this as a good thing. But what's far more important at this point is to understand exactly why once powerful politicians like Boehner are suddenly speaking out. And that has to do with another kind of green that we are all too familiar with in our political system: money. Now, last year, sales of legal marijuana were at least $17.5 billion, which is give or take about $50 for every man, woman, and child in America. It's a big industry. And the money that pot generates is part of the pitch that men like Boehner are making for legalization.
When I'm talking to politicians, cannabis jobs are a major selling point, but so is the tax revenue. Colorado, perfect example. Since 2014, they've collected in the neighborhood of $815 million in tax revenue from cannabis. That's not $815 million in sales. They're ringing up billions there. That's $815 million in just tax revenue. Colorado poured that money into infrastructure projects, plugging holes in budgets, healthcare. Heck, $21 million was handed to law enforcement. The police are using cannabis tax dollars to keep the streets safe. And the biggest chunk of this cash, $200 million, has gone toward building new schools. Out in Deer Trail, Colorado, there was an elementary school that was falling apart. Sewage leak in the locker room, swimming pool wasn't safe, school doors wouldn't lock.
But corporate advocates of pot aren't really concerned about money for schools. Former high-level politicians like John Boehner don't just become spokesmen for large industries for free. In a piece a few years ago on why Boehner changed his tune on pot, why he was speaking out, the New York Times showed that Boehner held a large stake in a $3 billion corporation then being sold to the biggest cannabis holding company in the world, Canopy Growth, to create an $18 billion monster. Buried deep in a financial filing from November 14th, 2018 is Acreage's disclosure. Acreage is the company that Boehner was representing. Acreage's disclosure that the two men each held 625,000 shares in the company, which if sold after the company's sale to Canopy, would net them a fortune. And behind Boehner are billions of dollars of investment, with the goal of building out an industry that could reach over $100 billion domestically and $1 trillion worldwide. Still, this leaves open the question of where the money's going to go and who will receive it. What's the business model? Pot is not like semiconductors or even cigarettes. It's easy to grow, which means that it's hard to maintain high profits. If you charge too much, someone else can just come to the market and undersell you. Consumers can even grow their own. The answer to how to keep profits and prevent competition in the market is monopoly. Now here's an excerpt of a presentation a few years ago at the American Cannabis Summit Countdown to Legalization. Now I really like this excerpt because it hits that sweet spot between boring and creepy that all great corporate sales pitches seemingly have. It'll give you a sense of just how investors and salesmen like Boehner are thinking about cannabis.
The first phase is a free-for-all. There are tons of startups and small firms. New players are constantly entering the market. Nobody has giant market share. No clear winners yet. Phase 2, that's where we see massive consolidation. Smaller companies start merging. Bigger companies acquire smaller ones. Phase 3, that's where the mega deals happen. The big guys start merging with each other. We've seen plenty of these deals eclipse $100 billion. Then phase 4 is where the action slows down. You have just a handful of big players in an industry. This is the blue chip stock phase. John, where do you think cannabis falls on this timeline?
We're in a sweet spot right now. Cannabis is nearing the end of phase 1, and here's where it gets me really excited. We're starting to see those red blinking lights, signaling this industry is about to jump into phase 2 with a bang. Rapid consolidation could lead to rapid profits for those who strike now. The writing's on the wall. Scott's Miracle-Gro, the boring fertilizer company, they were one of the first movers. Their CEO declared that cannabis was the biggest thing he's ever seen. Initially, he committed to investing $500 million in the sector. But then he starts buying cannabis companies, and he can't stop. Hydroponics and lighting companies, companies that sell soil to cannabis farmers. He's already cut checks totaling $705 million. Scott's Miracle-Gro isn't the only household name eyeing the cannabis market. Johnson & Johnson is linked up with two small firms. Coca-Cola is talking about making cannabis-infused beverages. I was on the board of a major tobacco company, Reynolds. You think big tobacco is staying on the sidelines? I've talked to these guys. They're going to sit this one out. And they have the dollars to acquire whoever they want. We're just beginning to see some action in this space. Imperial Brands, makers of Kool and Winston cigarettes, they invested in a medical marijuana research firm in the UK.
We can't forget the alcohol companies. On August 1st, Molson Coors announced they were partnering with Hexocorp to create cannabis-infused beverages.
But again, it's not that easy to create a monopoly around marijuana because it's a weed that grows, you can grow it anywhere. Now, sure, you can put marijuana into consumer products. You can make it easy to vape. There are markets for ancillary supplies to grow it, and all of these things have some barriers to entry. But the competitive threat of new entrants is always there. A lot of people know how to grow it already. So what's the plan? Well, they'll put cash into lobbying. Right now, the big weed companies are trying to get states to legally restrict competition so they can build and protect market power. In other words, they'll use the law to give themselves monopoly. Now take Curaleaf and Green Thumb Industries, two of the biggest cannabis corporations. Now here's what they're telling investors. Curaleaf says that it, quote, maintains an operational footprint of primarily limited licensed states with natural high barriers to entry and limited market participants, end quote. Now that's an annoying corporate speak way of saying they want monopoly power. Green Thumb Industries says it is seeking to operate in, quote, limited supply markets, end quote. That's a slightly shorter but equally annoying way of saying the same thing. In fact, Green Thumb's CEO told shareholders in one letter that, quote, every day is day one at Green Thumb. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should. It's because it's Amazon founder Jeff Bezos himself coined that phrase to describe his own firm, saying that at Amazon, it's, quote, always day one. And what he meant was Amazon employees should always be aggressive at seizing market power and crushing rivals and suppliers, as well as extracting tax concessions from cities and states who do business with them. So the weed executives now behind legalization are taking their inspiration, in fact, plagiarizing the slogan from perhaps the most aggressive monopolist in the world. But it's not all bad news. It's early. In fact, mostly it's good news. We're right now transitioning from illegal markets in marijuana to legal markets. It's very similar to what happened after the end of prohibition of alcohol that I mentioned at the top. Like alcohol, it's going to be regulated, or it's regulated right now at a state level. Now, because of alcohol, it's in the 21st Amendment to the Constitution. It says it's got to be regulated at a state level. But pot's a little different, the legal framework. Since pot is illegal at a federal level, but legal in some states, it's the states themselves that regulate it. And naturally, different states have chosen different models to organize these markets. So Oklahoma, for example, has 12,000 new weed businesses because of its particular regulatory model that allows competition by small firms. By contrast, Virginia handed out monopoly licenses, so there are fewer businesses. Now, it's an exciting time for cannabis because these are new markets, and so the rules are still being set. And how we structure these markets is very much up in the air. So what are the tricks the would-be monopolists are playing to game these markets in their favor? And how should states regulate their markets to best ensure competition? To answer these questions, I turn to an anti-monopolist and marijuana expert, Shalene Title. Shalene is a drug policy attorney and a fellow at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. She's actually written laws in Massachusetts to structure marijuana markets in a way that protects small producers and retailers. And now she thinks about the problem more broadly. So, Shalene, what are some of the tricks that the big weed monopolists are trying to use to gain and maintain market power?
So I'd say the biggest trick is looking for limited licensing market structures. So going into a state and saying, in order to keep this under control, you should only have 15 or 20 licenses to make and sell marijuana throughout the whole state. And then they will lobby to get themselves, usually because they're already in the medical market, early access to sell cannabis. And then they'll do the same thing at the city level. So at the city level, they'll say you should only have 2 or 3 cannabis stores in this whole city, and here's why they should go to us.
So which states have been pro-monopoly on weed legislation and which states haven't?
So I'd say Florida is one of the worst. But in general, the East Coast has kind of been worse because the West Coast legalized cannabis first, and it was kind of before it was clear how profitable it was going to be. And so you didn't have as many big companies involved or lobbying. But on the East Coast, you see companies really lobbying for these kind of oligopolistic market structures. I'd say some of the best are Washington, Oregon, and then Massachusetts is a unique one because even though we're on the East Coast, we did put a lot of work into ensuring that no company can dominate the market. You can't have more than 3 stores, for example. And we also invested a lot into making sure that we were reading contracts and making sure that what was happening in real life was the same as what was happening on paper.
What are the possible health consequences of consolidation?
So I've been an advocate for legalizing marijuana for over 20 years. So I understand the benefits. But the concern is when you look at tobacco or alcohol or pharma, when you have profits that are a primary concern, and you have companies that are so big that it becomes difficult to regulate them, then you see an incentive to make more people use your products and to worry more about your own profits than their health. And so there's nothing unique about cannabis that could prevent, for example, the products from being manipulated to be more addictive, or advertising that's targeted to children, or any of these other strategies that we've seen, frankly, in other industries like tobacco.
What should states do when writing laws to create a healthy market structure?
So in Massachusetts, we did 2 things. We tried to make a fair market that was accessible for small businesses in general. And then we tried to give particular advantages to the communities that have been most harmed by the war on drugs. But you can't really do one of those things without the other. Then we also tried to control the market from being dominated by limiting how many licenses one particular business or person can own. And then we paid attention even outside of cannabis businesses, because, for example, with delivery, there could be an app or a tech company. There could be an app or a tech company that could dominate delivery and then control the cannabis delivery market. So we were very clear that no tech company could share in the profits or own in a cannabis company. And they also have to make sure the transactions are arm's length and fair, so that you couldn't promote a cannabis company on your app just because they're paying you.
Now, it's still illegal at a federal level, so how should the federal government legalize marijuana?
I think the key is to be really slow and deliberate at the federal level. I think history and literature are full of examples of something that was started with so much optimism and love and then quickly became out of control, like Frankenstein. And I think we might be headed there with federal legalization if we don't stop and understand the market and make sure that we're legalizing it in a way that is intentional and deliberate. So, for example, I would not jump straight into interstate commerce. I think that we need to understand there are a lot of big companies that are waiting in the wings that have not entered the market yet because they don't want to put their other businesses at risk. But once federal legalization happens, interstate commerce is allowed, banking is allowed, we really have no way of predicting what it will look like and how fast consolidation will happen. So I think taking it one step at a time, allowing states to continue their current markets, perhaps that are just within the state borders, is a good idea, and just being careful that we don't go so fast we have results we can't take back.
Shalene, last question. So you've been doing this for 20 years. How's it going? Is big weed effective at lobbying? Are you optimistic about the possibilities for this market?
I'm very optimistic. Up to 90% of people now support the legal use of cannabis in some form. And at the same time, big weed is not very effective, even though big cannabis companies have hired former officials like John Boehner. They haven't been very successful. We haven't seen even one federal bill voted on by all of Congress yet. And so I think we have some time to do this deliberately. And I think that it can be, for once, a policy that is determined by the people and not by big corporations.
Thank you. And that was Shalene Title on setting up markets for marijuana. Now, it's an interesting moment where cannabis activists are the ones saying go slow, while previous hardcore drug warriors like John Boehner want legalization now, so that companies they are set up to rake in cash from can set up monopolies in this new industry. At any rate, if you take one thing away from this big breakdown, it's that there's no such thing as an entirely free market. Markets are public institutions, and someone always writes the rules. If you'd like to know more about big business and how our economy really works, you can sign up below for my Market Power Focused newsletter, Big. And remember, how we do business is how we do justice in America. Thanks.